So thank you so much, Scott. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to join today. I'm trying to actually project as a slideshow. Hopefully I don't also have technical difficulties. Are folks seeing that?
Yes, that looks good.
It looks great.
Awesome, thank you. Just some brief slides that I'll run through today with the presentation. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity to join this workshop series to chat with you today. I'm focusing on cybersecurity policy issues. So I'll be talking a bit today about some of the risks that we see from a cybersecurity kind of standpoint, some of the policy efforts that I've been involved in to manage those risks, and some of the ethical questions that I've seen arising along the way. I'll really be looking at two different policy issues, vulnerability management and critical infrastructure protection, in some depth to think about some of those ethical questions. But just to have them kind of in mind at the outset, I think some kind of consistent questions that I see and that we could think about thematically are things like, when we're talking about cybersecurity, who are we talking about in terms of the recipient of that security? So security for whom, right? In what context and by what measurement? If there's tension between national and international security, or between sort of online security for everyone and a country's national security objectives, so what gets prioritized when? Or even just sort of reflecting for you personally, would you prioritize security that would ensure that your water supply is not tampered with through the use of technology, or security that ensures that your government can penetrate the systems of an adversary during a time of conflict? So those are, I think, hard questions, right? And we can think about them in the abstract for sure. And I think in some ways it's really interesting as well to walk through the examples of vulnerability management and critical infrastructure protection and see the specific ways that they're teased out within those policy issues. But before I get to kind of thinking about those two specific examples or issues, I will just provide some quick sort of background context and some framing for this set of issues. And this is just like a brief snapshot as we dive in here of the really incredibly complex environment that we're facing today in terms of like sort of the devices and the attack surface, in terms of the cyber criminal activity and the enormous cost that it has sort of collectively on the global economy, as well as individually for organizations that are impacted by crime and other kind of malicious activity. And in terms of the government activity that we're seeing in this space, I think it's very interesting to reflect on the multiple roles that governments play in terms of cyberspace. So governments are technology users, right? We have a lot of government employees have their own PCs and other devices, right? And so they're actually users of technology. They're also protectors of technology in the sense that they want to help within their kind of national ecosystem all the other users of technology to be able to do so, to be able to use technology with security in mind and to do so safely and resiliently. They're a regulator in that sense too, right? That might be one tool that a government uses to kind of fulfill that protector role. But governments are also exploiters of technology. And one way to think about this that I think is kind of valuable is to recognize that we're all technology users. We don't always all wear the protector and regulator hats as well, but everyone sort of could also be a technology exploiter. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to be writing malware programs. But one thing that's sort of unique about cyberspace is the way that with some Bitcoin and some access to a computer, you could really kind of find and deploy some malicious sort of tools online that are kind of available in the black market and be an exploiter just like without moving from your chair. And so that's a really unique aspect of cyberspace for anyone that's a technology user. But it's also true of governments, that they have that sort of potentially have those multiple roles that across any single government, they're kind of managing the different equities of being a user, protector, regulator, and exploiter. And so you can see this here in just the regulatory activity that we see from governments that has exploded in the last few years. That's very much intended to sort of protect cyberspace, as well as the sort of activity within military and intelligence communities within governments to more explicitly acknowledge and really build out their capabilities in cyberspace and sort of think about ways to use technology to accomplish military and intelligence goals. So very complex environment is the kind of point here as we dive in. Just taking one kind of quick step back. This is very basic, and I apologize to everyone if this is way too basic, but I do think it's a helpful kind of thing to just have in mind as we'll kind of return to this framing of thinking about threats and vulnerabilities and consequences kind of throughout this talk. So what are we just basically talking about when we're talking about cybersecurity risks? And there are definitely ways to tinker with this equation for different organizations. But at some level, there is kind of a consistent need to think about threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences all sort of accruing to an organization's or a government's cybersecurity risk. Very, very briefly, when I'm saying something like threats, what I mean is sort of a range of things, right? We could think about environmental threats, things like hurricanes or earthquakes that could impact things like the functioning of a data center. Also thinking about actually more malicious attacks, things like we've all heard of ransomware, it's been in the news. Also thinking about the different sort of threat actors that act in this space and some of their different motivations. So we think about nation state groups that might deploy malicious attacks, criminals, sort of terrorist extremist organizations. And so that's one component of thinking about cybersecurity risk. Another is reflecting on vulnerabilities within your organization or again, within your government. There could be vulnerabilities in terms of the technology itself that's being used. So we tend to think about things like bugs in software or vulnerabilities in hardware, challenges with configuration. We think about humans themselves as also being a vulnerability in some cases for a lot of different reasons, right? We all have the friend that still does the kind of like password 1 as their password. that's sort of introducing a human vulnerability. A lot of us are, even if we are kind of using better cyber hygiene and developing really strong passwords, we might still be caught by social engineering attacks, those that sort of try to use information to sort of trick us into doing something. And also in terms of like insider threats within organizations, right? There's that kind of challenge with the human element in terms of vulnerabilities. And the third piece being about consequences. So this is something that we hear a lot in the cybersecurity space, the idea that you could have a consequence that would be about a breach of confidentiality, of integrity, or availability. So, if you have personal information that's stolen, that could be like a breach of confidentiality. Integrity of data is really important. So if there's something that happens where data is changed without your awareness of it, then you have a breach of integrity, for example, or a breach of availability when you need a service to be functioning and it fails for whatever reason. That's obviously quite a negative consequence. And this third bucket of consequences, I think, is especially interesting to think about today, because with the growth of things like Internet of Things, and on the last screen, we saw 20+ billion devices already deployed today, 9 billion devices being shipped every year with a microcontroller unit. Not all of them internet connected today by any means, and actually a relatively small percentage are, but increasingly every year, we are going to see more and more connectivity and more connectivity and sort of high consequence systems. And so that consequence area is really kind of an important one going forward for us to be thinking about. But really, all of these kind of elements of cybersecurity risk are in some ways having that increase. We also see it and if you think about vulnerabilities in terms of just the number of people that are coming online, actually increasing like every month. There's data that captures that, as well as, again, the devices and software that's available in the world. That attack surface continually increasing. And the third piece that we're thinking about a lot at Microsoft is also, and within our team, the increase in terms of the threats themselves, and in part because what capabilities threat actors are pursuing. So this timeline uses publicly available data to track sort of an increase in sophisticated attacks, many of which have been attributed to nation state actors. And what I think is helpful kind of just to fully appreciate this sort of escalating element of our risk equation is to think about, with regard to the threat actors in this space.
Amanda? I'm sorry to interrupt, but for some reason, looks like you're muted maybe all of a sudden.
I saw that too. Where did I drop off?
It was maybe just, I don't know, less than a minute ago. If it was like me anyway, I think for whatever reason, it just cut off about a minute ago.
Okay, really sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Strange. I was talking about the different groups of threat actors. Did you hear any of that about like nation states, multiple groups within nation states?
Kari was kind of saying, it sounded like maybe just at the beginning of the chart, it cut off. So I ask you to repeat too much, but maybe is any highlights from earlier on in the chart, and then you feel free to focus on what you just referenced.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm really sorry about that, and you break up a little there, Scott. But I think what I caught is I mean, it's basically just this chart is trying to show the increase just in the last 10 years, right? And sophisticated cyber attacks, many of which have been attributed to nation states, but then sort of taking a step back and thinking about the threat actors just as the threat element and the risk equation we just talked about, just in general, the explosion of activity from threat actors. I was saying there are multiple sort of groups of threat actors for us to think about. Nation states themselves, part of the sort of military and intelligence function within governments. There's often multiple groups within any one nation state that are sort of pursuing this sort of activity. There are also nation state proxies, so actors acting on behalf of a government, but not actually part of the government. Organized crime, and I mean to capture there both sort of like organized cyber criminals as well as organized crime that's like in our non-digital world that has increasingly moved into using digital technology to accomplish their sort of similar criminal goals. There's also less organized crime, like sort of the individuals here and there that might be really good tinkers, or they might just be able to sort of leverage the very robust black market that we talked about earlier, violent extremist groups. There are legit companies that are selling exploits. So just a ton to think about in terms of threat activity and what that means for the risk equation we were just talking about. I will just share that Microsoft has a threat intelligence unit internally called Mystic. And what we've seen, I think it's consistent with what a lot of others that sort of have this threat intelligence capability and share data publicly have found. But we have Mystic they use the periodic table of elements to kind of name different threat actor groups that they track and assess the activity of. And the Mystic is today tracking more than 70 code-named nation state groups. And they're also tracking, many more than that, like not code-named nation state groups, hundreds of sophisticated cyber criminal groups. Hopefully that gives you a sense, a lot of threat actor activity. And that's really a segue to talking a little bit about what our team, if I could get my slide to move. There we go. Is doing and focusing on that threat escalation in particular, as well as some of the other areas of the cyber risk equation or other elements of the equation that I just spoke about. So kind of starting from the right then, the digital peace team within our digital diplomacy team, there are kind of three teams that sit under this group that I'm part of. It is really focused on that sort of escalating threat actor activity, and in particular on that activity that's pursued by nation state groups. And sort of just a recognition that seeing more and more activity by nation states is escalating risk in a very unique way, in part because many nation states just have a sort of a unique amount of resources to apply towards cyber offensive activities. And so what we've already seen and what we anticipate seeing in the coming years is really worrying in terms of what this could do to escalating cyber risk. And so the Digital Peace Team is really focused on working with governments, many of whom are also very actively interested and working on what should be some of the kind of rules of the road or agreements, norms for managing that risk, and sort of maybe defining certain types of attacks that are off limits, or what the sort of consequence should be when a norm is not met, when someone deviates from an established norm to not commit a certain sort of attack. So the Digital Peace Team is very focused on that kind of threat part of the cyber risk equation. The Cybersecurity Policy Team, which is more focused on kind of partnering with governments in their protector and regulator role. So developing cybersecurity policy for the use of technology is really the focus. And when you're trying to think about how that relates to the cybersecurity risk equation, it's sort of the whole thing, in the sense that one of the areas of focus for the team is really promoting with governments and with organizations the idea that there should be that kind of holistic approach to thinking about cybersecurity risk. But then also beyond that, really focusing in on policies that are responsive to sort of the vulnerability and the consequence issues. I'll give an example in the context of IoT security policy. We're really focused on developing IoT security policies that are, reflective of challenges with the technology itself. So what are sort of baseline capabilities that we think from a security perspective all devices should have, or all IoT services should have. But that also relates to the consequence kind of element, because one thing that we're definitely thinking about is the IoT space is huge, as we've just talked about, and there's a lot of differentiation between types of IoT devices and environments in which they're deployed. And so part of that work is also thinking about, should there be different levels of security baselines for different types of devices, or for devices that are used in different environments. And then finally, the Defending Democracy team that sits within our digital diplomacy team is very focused on sort of one type of consequence, right? Like the consequences related to democratic sort of processes and institutions, and the threats that those processes and institutions are facing, and the vulnerabilities that exist in that context as well. So with that, all of that sort of background hopefully is helpful context. I want to move into thinking through the two kind of examples or issues that I mentioned at the beginning: vulnerability management and critical infrastructure protection, as two different areas in which we see a lot of different kind of policy activity, whether that be the sort of cybersecurity policy activity or what our team thinks about as digital peace or cybersecurity norms activity, that are really focused on enhancing security. But as we walk through kind of some of the elements of these different issues and some of the policy issues that arise within them, I'm just going to help to kind of try to highlight where there are some ethical questions that have maybe been answered in some way by policy responses, and where there are kind of some outstanding ethical questions. So first, vulnerability management. What I'm talking about here, and again, many of you I'm sure are very aware, but thinking specifically about a software bug, a vulnerability that ultimately enables a malicious actor to develop an exploit that sort of takes advantage of that vulnerability. We definitely have a lot of processes in place as a community of sort of technology providers that are intended to mitigate that risk that there will be vulnerabilities in software or hardware. In the software context, we call this software assurance processes or security development life cycles. However, there remain many vulnerabilities oftentimes in software. And so it's a challenge to think about after you have released software, how do you deal with that ongoing sort of potential that there are vulnerabilities, and how do you continue to protect users and improve the security of those products and services? So that's really what I'm thinking about here. And for the sake of simplicity, really thinking about security vulnerability in a company's product or service, so not like necessarily in the open source context. There are a few different things that could happen, right, when there is a security vulnerability and a product or service. And they're kind of outlined there in the middle of the screen. Some that don't necessarily bring to the forefront any specific sort of ethical questions, because, found and fixed, that's great. Found by someone who intends to sell it, not for a bug bounty, not so great. Found by someone who tends to exploit it, again, from our perspective, not so great. But not as much policy activity that's really existing today in response to that. But two that I do want to focus in on, found by a security researcher that might handle that vulnerability in a few different ways, or found by a government entity that, again, has a few different choices for what it does with that vulnerability. So I'll start with found by a security researcher. The question that sort of comes to the forefront is, what should that security researcher do with that vulnerability, and what happens based on what they do? And so, there's always the option that the security researcher does nothing. They find the vulnerability, they don't share it with anyone. Obviously, then the vulnerability is not fixed. The product and service continues to have the potential to be compromised, which is not great for security. I will just flag, I think this is an interesting one. I think it's one that vulnerability kind of management and disclosure challenges between security researchers and between technology companies has been an issue for a long time, maybe 90s-ish. But this is one where it used to be a huge problem. I think it still is a problem today, but in some ways has been answered a bit by some sort of corporate policy and by some public policy. So one of the reasons that there used to be, I think, even more so than today, hesitation with sharing vulnerabilities was that there was a real and fair concern about what a company might do if a security researcher reported a vulnerability to that company. There were threats of legal action, for example, in response to that security researcher who was just sharing that information. From the company's perspective that was receiving it, they sort of felt like they were being attacked and that there was something that was unfair in terms of what the security researcher was doing and looking at their products and services. Again, I don't want to say that this problem is solved, because especially with the Internet of Things and so many new technology providers becoming technology providers, right? So companies that used to do basically anything else, and now, like car manufacturers, and now they are technology providers because cars have so much connectivity built in. There's a real challenge with kind of figuring out how to coordinate that with the community of security researchers that a lot of technology companies have worked on over the last decades. And so there are remaining challenges there, but I say to some extent, I think the ethical question of what that security researcher should do and how that company should react has been resolved to some extent, because I think technology companies in particular that have been doing this for decades have really come around to realizing the incredible security value that can be provided by security research and by folks that are just doing this for their job or because they enjoy tinkering or any other kind of good reason for it. And also, there have been some public policy efforts to really recognize and welcome security research. So we've seen in the US sort of exemptions on some legal authorities that could challenge security research that have been extended in recent years because of recognition of the real value that security researchers could play. So that one's not solved, but there's been some public policy activity and company activity to try to address the concerns there. A security researcher could also share the vulnerability information directly with the company that manages, that has sold the product or service, and the company then could be in a position to fix that vulnerability, developing a patch or other mitigation. There are still some kind of questions there. This is something that we as a company are incredibly supportive of, find incredibly valuable, that partnership with security researchers, and find it most productive when we have that direct exchange with a security researcher that provides vulnerability information. But there are still some questions about how that process works. Again, are companies ready to receive that vulnerability information? Sometimes it can be a lot. And some questions related to timeline around public disclosure that I'll get to in a moment. Because the third option is that a security researcher could share that vulnerability information in the public domain. And again, this used to be even more of an issue than it is now, but in some ways is an ongoing conversation more around timelines for public disclosure when a vulnerability is reported to a company. But the reasoning behind this from a security researcher perspective might be there's a real need to kind of let everyone know about a vulnerability even before there's a fix, or there's a real need to push a company to develop a patch or other mitigation more quickly than if they don't have the pressure of the information being in the public domain. Just want to pause here because, again, even with submitting the kind of information to a company, there is that question about when should it go to the public domain? Should it be after a patch or mitigation is developed so that all the users of a technology product or service are protected? Or should there be sort of acceptance from a normative perspective for researchers sharing that information publicly before a fix is ready, because they're sort of putting pressure on the technology provider? And I think it really is an interesting question that brings up some of the framing questions that we talked about at the outset of kind of security for whom and what context and by what measurement. From our perspective, we are really focused on what we call coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which we define as there is no release of the vulnerability information in the public domain until a patch or mitigation is developed, unless we see evidence of the vulnerability already being used in the wild. And the reason for that is that we're really focused on protecting most of our customers who, until a patch is developed, are really not going to be in a position to protect themselves from that vulnerability. And if it's released publicly, then there's more of a risk that an exploit might be developed. But the counter argument is very much that if we release that information in the public domain, then we can force Microsoft or others to maybe develop those patches or mitigations more quickly. There are lots of kind of follow-on kind of implications to how quickly a patch is developed and what vulnerabilities get prioritized and having an impact on security. So when there is kind of pressure to release a patch or mitigation for a particular vulnerability, that means that some of the attention to potentially address more serious or more consequential vulnerabilities might have to be set aside. And there's also the challenge of a lot of users are not in a place where they can really protect themselves unless there's a patch or mitigation, but some are. And some of those users might be the ones who are really desiring more information in the public domain sooner. So an interesting kind of question about security for whom and in what context and by what measurement. Even more so, and kind of thinking about the national versus international security framing that we've had, is what happens when a vulnerability is found by a government entity, and what happens in response to that. There are lots of ways this could happen, right? We have, just like at Microsoft, folks that are looking for vulnerabilities and trying to protect products and services. There are also folks in the government that have that role, or that might be looking for vulnerabilities to exploit products or services, or might have them reported to them by outsiders, or a number of other ways in which governments can come to acquire a security vulnerability. The key question is that vulnerability then used for the intelligence or military purposes that we've talked about a bit, or is it reported to a company that's in a position to fix it? And this is a really, I think, interesting and hard question from a national and international security perspective. A lot of governments have been starting to develop and acknowledge publicly something called a vulnerabilities equities process, in which governments actually have a formal process for looking at the vulnerabilities that they have or that they've acquired in some way and making a decision about, whether or not the government should hold on to that vulnerability and continue to maybe figure out a way to use it as part of an exploit, or should the government again report it to the company and have it be fixed, and as a result have also like all the government users of technology be protected, as well as users within the national community be protected, and international community. One thing that we think is really kind of important, just as sort of a preview for maybe some of my concluding points, is that there are transparent processes in place to have these conversations and that really force that kind of balancing of interests and equities, and that there are stakeholders at the table that represent that balance of stakeholders, or excuse me, balance of interests and equities. So not just a conversation that's driven by, for example, the DoD that might have a stronger inclination towards those military and intelligence purposes, but also, the Department of Homeland Security that's thinking about protecting the federal networks and critical infrastructure in the US, the Department of Commerce that's thinking about, companies more broadly in the US and the risks that they might be facing. Someone like the FTC that has more of a kind of consumer protection role, just to make sure that there is representation of those different equities and that they're part of the conversation. So I don't know what my time is like, but maybe just very briefly.
No, that you're doing great. This has been amazing.
Okay, good.
A rocky start. It's the first time I've ever had to say "for the love of God" in the start of an introduction. So I will introduce you properly again when you're done, Amanda. But this has been amazing. So thank you for picking up the ball after I threw it by the wayside.
No worries at all. Glad to hear that. And I'm like, I don't know if my phone's dead, so I literally have no idea what the time is. So please do tell me if I'm taking too much time. But
no, you're great. It's only been basically a half an hour since you really started talking. So feel free to take a little bit longer. And then just a reminder to everybody, we'll do questions just via the Q&A function. So feel free to start uploading those at any point.
Cool. Thanks, Scott. So very quickly then, I think just to kind of ground this in an example might be helpful. And maybe this is something that folks have heard about if you've watched it all, any of the cybersecurity headlines in the last few years, something called WannaCry, which kind of famously impacted hospitals in the UK, and has been attributed to being an attack that was coming from the North Korean government. But also got a lot of attention because the exploit that was used in the WannaCry attack, something called Eternal Blue, which leveraged some vulnerabilities in Windows and was developed by the NSA. And that became sort of public information because there was information from NSA that was stolen and that was sort of shared publicly by a group called the Shadow Brokers. And so it really brought to light this issue of, what can happen when a government holds on to a vulnerability, like the sort of realizing that they had these vulnerabilities in Windows, and is holding on to and using a potential exploit, and then like what risks that can create if that information is made public, and then can be leveraged by other organizations like the North Korean government and affect things like the functioning of a hospital in the UK. And there was at some point a reporting of that vulnerability information, and a patch developed as well, but as many of you might be aware, sort of deployment of patches is not always timely. And that's really challenging. It's sort of maybe a separate conversation to be had about security, but it's a real problem. And so, having there be last minute patching, a lot of things didn't get patched. That means that they were really affected by those organizations that hadn't patched, were really affected by that exploit. And so there's just real world examples of these government decisions having impact on people and their security, both their digital security and even like their physical security, if you think about something like the hospital context. One other thing that example of WannaCry brings up that is interesting in this context is to think about, okay, you have a vulnerability. Ideally, it at some point reaches the company that manages the product service. Ideally, that company has a way to kind of process that vulnerability information, develop a patch mitigation, they deploy it. Ideally, at some point, organizations that are using that technology and are then going to patch it. However, you do also have this question about for how long should companies be responsible for patching it? And this is something that came up in the WannaCry context because some of the organizations that were impacted by WannaCry were using Windows XP. So they were using Windows XP, which was something that was released in 2001 in 2017. So that is a challenge, right? It's a reality for a lot of organizations that they're going to be using an operating system like that for a long time, especially in some types of systems. But from a Microsoft perspective, there had been generations of Windows that had been developed after Windows XP that just had a different level of security and capability sort of built in. We've learned a lot from 2001. So an operating system that we were developing in 2008 or 2010 or 15 would have been much different. And from our perspective, much better, even from a security perspective. And so at some point, companies, Microsoft being one, lots of others, like sort of have this, what we call end of life for that technology product or service, wherein that sort of, it's no longer supported from a patching perspective, that the sort of security energy and attention is focused on more recent software and devices. But it's a question really, again, that I would go back to the security for whom, in what context, and really by what measurement, because I think that this is a really hard question that we're going to be grappling with in the coming years, especially with IoT devices. What is a reasonable expectation for a support timeline and for an end of life for an operating system for a device? What will happen when there are IoT providers that go out of business and they actually just can't manage the security of their devices? But from a Microsoft perspective, it's I think really interesting because you have this kind of, if you are supporting it forever, you're supporting an operating system that is just fundamentally less secure, even with the patches that you're providing, versus if people are going to be using it anyway. So there should be some protection of it. It's a real challenge. And I think something that if we think there are other kind of public policy activities that have half resolved or partially resolved some of these tensions, that's one where I think there's going to be some attention going forward. And it's, I think, a hard set of questions. Well, moving on to my second example, I'm trying to be cognizant of the time, Scott. Let me know if I need when I should stop. But
oh, sure. Yeah, I think at least having 10 minutes for Q&A would be nice at the end. But beyond that, I think you're great.
Great. So stop me if I'm approaching that and I'm blathering on. But so the other example I wanted to talk through is critical infrastructure protection. And this is one that kind of relates back to what we were talking about in the cybersecurity risk equation in terms of consequences, right? Because we're seeing a lot of critical infrastructure become increasingly connected, and beyond that, actually use technology in an increasingly sort of critical way, just like not just for email, but for more critical workloads, using digital services. And so that obviously has some security benefits potentially if organizations are deploying and using technology in a secure way, but it also has some risks if they're not. And this is an area that from both the kind of cybersecurity policy perspective and from the digital piece perspective within our digital diplomacy team, we're really thinking a lot about. From a cybersecurity policy perspective, we're doing a lot of work in which we're focused on what are, kind of like we talked about in the IoT security context, what are the security baselines that really should be sort of fundamental to different critical infrastructure sectors, and what are the responsibilities of technology providers and the critical infrastructure operators themselves in implementing those security baseline requirements. But there's also a digital piece component to this from our perspective, because while using security baselines should hopefully help critical infrastructure organizations be protected from some level of threat activity, there's also arguably like some nation states and that are just have a different level of resources and that are going to be able to conduct attacks that it's going to be very difficult for these organizations to defend against. And so that's where, you know, some of our digital peace work has really been focused, and thinking about what should be the sort of norms for state behavior related to critical infrastructure. And so we've been thinking a lot about this. The international community more broadly absolutely has as well. I have on the slide a couple of examples of activity that's happened in recent years in this space. There's been, I guess I'm seeing that I forgot to put UN group of governmental experts in that 2015 first line there, but it's actually a UN group of governmental experts, about 20 to 25 governments that came together in 2015 and basically acknowledged this, that like there should not be knowing support or knowing pursuit of activity by governments that affects the critical infrastructure of another government. There is also in 2018, there was a kind of something that the French government really drove, but really was a multi-stakeholder agreement called the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, where there was again sort of a condemnation of nation state attacks that affect critical infrastructure. This is an agreement that 78 plus governments in the world have signed, actually more than 1,000 organizations totally, including those governments, as well as industry, civil society, academia, lots of organizations supporting this call for trust and security in cyberspace. And even this year, we've seen an effort called, I think, the Oxford process. There have been 3 different statements on kind of the state of international law as it relates to protecting different aspects of critical infrastructure. So the first one was focused on the healthcare sector and a recognition that international law prohibits activity on healthcare, commonly recognized as critical infrastructure. A second one that was really focused on vaccine research in this year of COVID. And the third one that actually just wrapped up, I think a couple of days ago, that was really focused on current existing international law protections against cyber attacks on electoral processes. So there's been a lot of attention and energy in this space. And yet, I think as I included in my write-up, like we just saw, for example, a potentially maybe the first death that could be attributed to a cyber attack because a hospital in Germany was impacted by a ransomware attack. Now, I think we don't know for sure who conducted that attack, who it should be attributed to. Seems like probably not a nation state, but the reaction and response wasn't like, oh, it wasn't a nation state, we don't care, right? I think it was recognition that it could have been. You think back to WannaCry, North Korea, and the UK hospitals that were affected, it seems entirely feasible that it, or probable that it might have been. And so it's concerning that there's been activity and attention in the space, but I don't think anyone has a lot of confidence that there's a clear norm really existing that everyone's adhering to not attack critical infrastructure of other countries during times of peace even. So why? The question is why? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One sort of a definitional problem and one a sort of more of an ethical question. On the definitional side, you might think it's relatively straightforward, but in some ways it's not, because it's unclear to what extent some of these normative statements are really intending to capture just an attack that actually happens and impacts those organizations versus something that's sometimes called in cyberspace and more broadly like prepping the battlefield. So the idea that an organization could, or a nation state actor could hold the infrastructure of another country at risk by sort of prepping the battlefield, having maybe vulnerabilities and exploits that they've developed and deployed and that they're ready to sort of turn on, but they don't yet. And so there's that definitional question that's really kind of unanswered. And there's also the ethical question about, what is the impact of whether we're talking about the actual sort of cyber attack that happens or that prepping the battlefield sort of activity. What is the risk of that relative to the risk of just kinetic attacks between countries, right? Is there some perception that there being solely kinetic sort of attacks, it's worse, and so we kind of have cyber attacks as a pressure release on that sort of international tension between nation states? Sometimes the example of Stuxnet is given in this context because perhaps like if there was not the option of pursuing a cyber attack that affected Iran's capability then of uranium enrichment, then perhaps there could have been a kinetic attack, and would that have been worse? And so really, I think there's an interesting sort of set of questions here, and really impacts that we're uncertain about. Like, could this kind of even prepping the battlefield activity that nation states might pursue that would affect the critical infrastructure of another state have a deterrent effect? Maybe, maybe not, because at the same time, you know, we also see that cyber operations may offer sort of a temptation to strike first. Lots of prepping the battlefield and sort of consistent engagement makes it hard to distinguish between offense and defense. And so it could be sort of escalatory activity, really intensifying competition. Also, you know, there's real potential for destructive attacks in cyberspace, even without kinetic activity. And so the potential for harm here is very real. We can also think about tying this back to the vulnerability management discussion that we have. There could be consequences for the security of others if a government is holding on to a vulnerability in order to hold infrastructure at risk. And the kind of last piece is also, we're like in the early years of cyber conflict. So as we have more and more sort of dependency on digital technologies, as the stakes continue to rise in this space, so do the risks at some level. And so it's hard to anticipate like what the risk is of this sort of cyber conflict relative to just kinetic conflict. Even when national security efforts are stating that they're intended to absorb tension, to lower aggression, to foster stability, you know, it's uncertain that they do in terms of international security. And there's also the fact that their decisions have these broader impacts on everyone's security. So these are really, I think, again, interesting questions. I think there's really, it's hard to have a complete answers. But, you know, a few closing thoughts. I think, of course, to some extent, as we've been talking about, the answer depends on your point of view. Best answering those questions of best for whom and what context and really by what measurement. From a Microsoft perspective, you know, we're most focused, unsurprisingly, on protecting our customers. National and international security more broadly, of course, matter to us being able to function as a company in a stable system. But and there is almost always going to be that sort of balancing of interests and equities for any stakeholder. But our kind of end answer will be weighted always heavily in favor of what's sort of going to protect our customers. But your point of view could differ, that of a government could differ, that of another organization or company could differ. The thing that's interesting about cyberspace is that it's an incredibly interconnected space in which we're all technology users. Many of us could be exploiters, as we've talked about. And we're all impacted, though, by these cybersecurity risks because there's such a tight interconnection when literally everyone is using the internet. And something that happens in one node can really have an impact on many others in just minutes. And so that's why, from our perspective, considering this interconnectedness, but considering the fact that there's real potential for variation among different point of views, it's actually really important to have multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue on these issues. It's really critical to kind of highlighting, to representing, and then also to working through all those different tensions and equities. It sounds like a little bit basic, I think, to say like that's a sort of recommendation on a path forward. But I think especially in a space like this where there's this tension between a lot of the private sector owning and operating a digital technology, this being sort of fundamental government space of managing security, international and national security, there is tension related to this, but we are also seeing progress. So I would say in like the 2016 timeframe, I was just invited to give a few comments related to the UN group of governmental experts process that was going on in that time. And I came prepared to talk about all of Microsoft's ideas about norms for state behavior, norms for technology company sort of behavior that would be responsible. And like the only question that I got asked that people really wanted to talk about was like why I even was there. Like why is a private sector company even here trying to participate in this conversation? Like what's your role?
That's the problem, right?
Yeah. And that perspective definitely persists. But I also do think we've made some progress. Like I mentioned the 2018 Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace, and the French government was very keen in 2018 to figure out a way to bring in not just governments, but companies, academia, civil society to that agreement. And you see here the UN Secretary General really recognizing fundamentally that this is a multi-stakeholder problem. It's going to take all of us. And we've seen in the last 2 years, the UN sort of, high-level panel on digital cooperation process that's sort of grown into the digital cooperation roadmap that the UN is pursuing, really make space and find meaningful roles for academia, civil society, and for companies in the UN, this institution that's fundamentally about nation states. And so I think there's much work to do here, but like this is an interesting sort of path forward that is getting more attention and energy, along with the kind of fundamental recognition that we are past the days of designing and using technology without deliberately thinking about security. The path forward also does require this kind of partnership across stakeholders. So that, thank you, and I hope that I left some time.
We do. No, well, first off, a virtual round of applause, because that really was a tour de force. And thank you so much again for your patience. So you've been hearing from Amanda Craig, the director of cybersecurity policy at Microsoft. Been at Microsoft for more than 6.5 years now, but took over as the director of this whole cybersecurity policy unit earlier this year. So just a phenomenal amount of work that you guys have been up to in this space. And I should mention as well, NIU alum, which we're very proud of. We do have some time for questions, just a couple minutes, unfortunately, but we'll get in as many as we can in a bit of a lightning round. So yeah, Rajiv, I think it's a great point about the public and private sectors needing to learn from each other in this context. Asif Lubin, who just recently joined the Maurer School of Faculty, had a great question that I wanted to tee us off with. And his question is up in the chat box and the Q&A, so you might be able to see that. But he says, earlier this month, Microsoft played a big role in taking down a criminal botnet, TrickBot, under a Virginia court order. Microsoft helped pioneer the use of court orders to dismantle botnets in recent years. How is Microsoft thinking about the ethics of court-ordered hackbacks from both a domestic and international dimension? Well, you can do that in 2 minutes, right, Amanda?
Yeah, no problem. So I wonder if your court-ordered hackbacks.
And that might be more of a legal team issue as well, as opposed to cyber policy. So.
Well, let me just say, yes, this is actually a set of activities that is pursued by something called the Digital Crimes Unit, which is in the division of Microsoft that I sit in, but absolutely is not my day job. So I would be happy if you want to go into more depth to connect you with folks from that team that can go into that depth with you, much more so than I can. But I like what I would say, I think hopefully in response to your question, is that we actually think that there is an incredibly important sort of public-private partnership that needs to happen in this space. We don't believe that private sector companies should be hacking back themselves, and with the recognition that like what we mean by hack back, it could differ, right? But like the more kind of aggressive hack back scenarios that are talked about in the community, we think that there's not really a role for the private sector to be doing that. And so there really is a need for a partnership with the government that can provide these sort of legal orders for this kind of activity, rather than companies feeling like they should pursue it themselves without going through that legal process. And there's a real complementarity in terms of public and private sector capabilities in terms of that operational collaboration. So that is important. There's a lot of room for improvement in what that operational collaboration really looked like. And part of the reasoning for that is that when we think about something like that takedown, obviously that is being pursued because that's something from a Microsoft perspective and from the threat environment that we see, that takedown is impactful for security. But from our experience in these public-private partnerships, sometimes those decisions are kind of more opportunistic and based on the perspective of one provider, in this case, like our perspective of what would be helpful for security. And ideally, there would be really good collaboration in terms of understanding what the threat environment looks like from a collective standpoint, as well as where is the really kind of like priority high impact activity that could be pursued. And there's lots of challenges in terms of just like how operational collaboration works between the public and private sector, what the incentives look like in the public sector, like for the FBI folks that are actually doing some of this work and are maybe still driven by the need to to do kind of more formal prosecutions with naming and shaming and attribution and all of that, which is just really challenging in cyberspace. So valuable, room for improvement. Hopefully that helps, and happy to connect you with the digital crimes unit if not.
Microsoft is a bit of a large organization with quite a few things going on, so it's completely understandable. And I thought that was very helpful, and I'm sure, Asif, that we can follow up as needed. We're pretty much out of time, unfortunately, but just one other really quick one that Daniel posed, Amanda, if that's okay. And his question is basically, from your view, have organizations started to change their perspective with regards to using software, maybe from less of a you kind of used the analogy of building a house here, right? So less from the view of a particular product for a particular problem, and maybe thinking about it in a more comprehensive format. And then maybe you could take that in the direction of cloud if you would like to, or you could also kind of think about some regulatory changes that are coming, and some of which have already happened. Like in France, I'm thinking about the extension of products liability law and kind of strict liability for internet connected devices, kind of harkening back to your Internet of Things discussion earlier too. So I'm kind of wondering, are regulators starting to force this change in mindset, or do you think we still have kind of a long way to go to get to that more kind of comprehensive view of this shared ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think, I might be misunderstanding the first part of the question, but definitely there.
I might be too. So Daniel, I apologize if I butchered that. Sorry.
No, I think that there absolutely is effort to develop technology that can be multi-purpose, and there's just such a range, right? Like it's impossible to probably cover well, but you do have sort of basic cloud services that provide all kinds of functionality, all the way to like a very specific, like basically you're equivalent to just an application that has a very specific sort of purpose in terms of providing a cloud service, and you have everything in between. And so there is incredible variability across that environment. And I think it is a challenge for regulators then to think about how to deal with that breadth. And I think in part, and when we think about the Internet of Things, especially, that's the importance of thinking about the consequences, right, and the different environments. So there might be a need to have a more tailored approach so that you're really focusing on risks of greatest concern. This is something that I do think is really important, especially as, to your point, we do see more regulatory activity, and we expect more in the coming years, like in the cloud security policy context, for example. Absolutely, today, cloud services are impacted by some direct regulation, some indirect regulation, like through their customers, a lot of procurement requirements that impose sort of baselines for security. But beyond that, expect a lot more direct regulation coming. And I think a challenge for cloud providers or for governments will be figuring out, like, do they apply the same sorts of requirements to all cloud providers, just the same as they are dealing with that in the IoT space? Is there differentiation? How do they make that differentiation? And so I think from our perspective, it's hard because you want to have all of the risks managed, right? But in reality, unfortunately, there has to be prioritization. There's limited resources, limited energy. And if you take resources from less important things, that means that you're not doing all that you can to protect those really high impact scenarios. And so there has to be risk prioritization, and figuring out how to do that across different technology is something that regulators, I think, will absolutely be working on in the coming years.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. That's just brilliant. And we're officially over time at this point, but just by way of conclusion, I'm wondering, I'd be kind of remiss if I didn't at least bring up the election next week. And I'm just wondering how you're feeling about the role that Microsoft has been able to play in election security here in the States, of course, but also, globally, and frankly, how optimistic you are about the direction and the progress that we're making. And if you'd also like to throw a quick note out to Hal, he was asking, hey, are you guys hiring? So you can feel free to throw that in as well. And then we'll conclude, everybody. And feel free to drop off as needed. So please, Amanda, go ahead.
Please, yeah. So Microsoft, I think, is generally always hiring. So go to the website and the careers website, and I think hopefully you'll find lots of open positions that hopefully are of interest. On elections, what a good question. So this has been, and again, this is more of I focus on the cybersecurity policy and digital peace team. So I will give my I'll give my 2 cents, but a lot more work than I can fully represent here, like that our Defending Democracy team has been doing to really think about protecting, again, sort of like elections themselves and electoral infrastructure, thinking about how to help protect campaigns, and thinking about the disinformation defense challenge. Now, I'll just say, like at the outset, I feel like the disinformation defense challenge is one that everyone is continuing to struggle with. There's some things that we've done to kind of integrate and promote functionality like NewsGuard that kind of grades the transparency of news sources within browsers. But it's just, it's a drop in the bucket. There's so much to do with this information defense. And so I'm sorry, I'm not more optimistic and and what I'm conveying about that landscape, but I think just a lot to do and a lot to work on. In the context of, campaign security and electoral infrastructure security, I do think a lot of progress has been made, although also still a lot to do. So maybe that's the theme across these different areas. We've released a couple of tools called Account Guard, called Election Guard, that are responsive to risks in those different areas. I think that there's been incredible uptake, especially in the US, but also internationally, of Account Guard, which is sort of a set of services and sort of turned on configurations that that we've created that are especially relevant to sort of protecting the security of campaigns. And the use has been really positive so far. The feedback has been really positive so far. And I think it's interesting to think even beyond the sort of campaign organization context, what lessons learned could be ported to other spaces there in terms of like having offerings that come with some of those configurations turned on that are a little bit easier for users, but where there might be some challenges or kinks to work through in terms of like how those offerings intersect with other issues like privacy regulations and that sort of thing. And the same I would say in the electoral infrastructure context, although I think that one is maybe even harder. And I'm the most familiar with the work in the US where there are just like a couple of different voting machine companies. At the same time, there is incredible decentralization across how the US manages this set of risks. And from our kind of entry into this conversation and developing something like Election Card, which is really sort of just a technology that we are putting out there for these kind of election infrastructure companies to use, there are so many challenges related to how, for bringing back to vulnerability management, how some of the electoral systems are patched today, the challenges that those companies have with managing patches and having to recertify their infrastructure every time they deploy a patch, which is just incredible and it's really untenable, as well as like having a consistent baseline of security across all of the sort of decentralized electoral infrastructure in the US. And I think DHS has been very focused on this and has been tireless in their efforts, but bringing everybody up to that same baseline of security is just tough. There's really a lot of work. And so I would say there's been meaningful effort and progress, but more to be done for sure. And we'll see about Tuesday.
Indeed we will. Excellent. Well, hey, another virtual round of applause because that was just wonderful. And sorry to keep you over a little bit, Amanda, and all of you. Thanks again for your patience, for sticking with, and thank you, Amanda, again for allowing us to feature you and all of the incredible work you guys are doing at Microsoft. So thanks so much, and keep safe, everybody, and don't forget to vote. That's right. Thanks again.